The following program is being brought to you on the Voice America Business Channel. For more information about our network and to check our additional show hosts and topics of interest, please visit voiceamericabusiness.com. The Voice America Talk Radio Network is the worldwide leader in live Internet talk radio. Visit voiceamerica.com. The views and ideas expressed on the following program are strictly those of the host or guests and do not necessarily reflect the views and ideas held by the Voice America Talk Radio Network, its staff, and management.
Welcome to Quantum Business Insights, emerging perspectives on people, process, and profits. Your host is Olivia Parr-Rud. In today's fast-paced, high-tech global economy, the business landscape is constantly evolving. To be successful, companies must continually adapt as well as identify and exploit new opportunities. Now, here is the host of Quantum Business Insights, Olivia Parr-Rud.
Welcome to Quantum Business Insights. I'm your host, Olivia Parr-Rud. Each week on Quantum Business Insights, I explore the changing nature of business with thought leaders from around the globe. My hope is that through deep dialogue and inquiry, we'll discover new approaches and perspectives that can help us all be more successful in our business. I especially want to draw attention to those systems and processes that take advantage of what I feel is our most valuable asset, our human capital. The topic for today's show is the organizational ecosystem, mapping complexity to adaptability. To offer a little context, last week we were looking at how the business landscape has changed over the last 20 to 30 years. And I think you'll agree that one of the most dramatic changes is the level of complexity in business as well as in life in general. And sometimes that can leave us with a feeling like things are out of control. And to some extent they are. But the good news is there are ways to manage complexity and even use it to our advantage. It just takes a slightly different perspective. So today my guest is Denise Easton. Denise is an entrepreneur, consultant, and CEO who has worked extensively across the corporate, public, and education sectors. She brings multi-industry experience and expertise in business management, product development, network and knowledge systems, and strategic innovation. Denise co-founded Complexity Space Consulting, where her research and work focuses on helping clients build adaptive, innovative, and financially successful programs and products by understanding and influencing the dynamics within complex systems. The complexity framework was developed as a business application model for complex system analysis, business process improvement, organizational design, development, and change. Denise also co-founded and serves as CEO of AdaptKnowledge, a leading knowledge management firm focused on the strategic integration of technology-enhanced learning and development for organizations. Denise, welcome to Quantum Business Insights.
Thank you, Olivia. I'm delighted to be here and to have this conversation today. And you really did hit on what we think is probably the most fundamental opportunity and concurrently the most fundamental challenge that organizations have today, which is within their human capital.
Thank you. So I really like this concept of the complexity space. It feels like a container for managing what we might think of as the unmanageable, so to speak. In other words, we're talking about the increase in complexity and how it can leave us feeling like things are out of control. What is the complexity space, and how can I use it to be more successful?
That is a question that could keep us here in this conversation for a lifetime. But what the complexity space emerged from was our desire to look at a way to understand and influence the construct of operating in a world in which complex human organizational systems dominate. And that's a lot of words. But I'd like to start with maybe a comparison and a metaphor.
Right.
We have two different ways to operate. One is as a mechanic. and we've used this repeatedly because mechanics are very competent at what they do, and we need to have mechanics in our world, and we need to be able to not only build and change and replace the parts within machines, but we need to have that infrastructure exist. But our organizations can not only be served by the mechanics, they also have to understand and be served by gardeners who are working in a complex environment, an environment where they can know things, but they can't know everything. So both known knowns and known unknowns, and then the inevitable unknown unknowns exist. So in a garden, we can plant, we can fertilize, we can really be very scientific on the zones in which we're going to be gardening, the plants we're going to be putting in there, how often they should be watered. But something can happen, and inevitably something will happen. There's a huge storm, or there's some type of a bug or infection or blight that occurs. But at the same time, we recognize that we will be persistent in looking at what our opportunities are. So, in the complexity space, we like to think, what can we do to innovate, to grow, and succeed when both the future is unknown and potentially unknowable? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and I really like that metaphor because I guess when you think about the garden, you're sort of creating a space and fertilizing it and planting it, but you really don't have total control over what comes out of it, is sort of what you're saying, it sounds like.
Exactly. And so based on that premise, I'd also like to share with you and the audience both a recognition and an absolutely deep imperative and belief in the fact that we need to have, traditional linear processes when we're looking at a total organization. And again, this goes back to a complexity construct. We live in a world where everything is there all the time. So like the mechanics and gardeners, they both work together and they're both necessary when creating an environment that's going to be healthy and sustainable for everybody. Organizations need to be able to do a process. We need to be able to have, a deliverable to the bottom line. But at the same time, we need to have the systems and models and the opportunity to allow everyone within the organization to respond in a nonlinear way. And this is where the complexity space, I think, actually starts to make more sense, certainly to our clients. So what we tell them and how we work at it is that it's the understanding and influencing what you need to do. There's going to be no organization that's going to be completely unstructured, but there are opportunities to look at how can you operate in this organizational construct where you have structure and unstructure, where you have deeply constrained and rule-oriented behaviors, and you have innovation and chaos. And from complexity science, there's this beautiful middle ground that complex adaptive systems wants to create. And this is where everything exists all the time. In a complex adaptive system, you have both the unknown and the known, the chaos and the structure, the order and the disorder. And being able to find that sort of happy medium, I think there's, think of a sweet spot. Mm-hmm. Think of a place where there's emerging possibilities. Think of being adaptive and agile. And these are all words that are being used in current business publications on a frequent and regular basis. And complexity allows you to leverage the energy that's created between this, I think of it as a percolating pot of innovation and ideas that have not quite yet formed, the structures that we know that do work, and to find this place where you can take both of them and find a better path forward.
Well, that makes a lot of sense because when we were speaking last week about how business has changed, one of the things that's happened is a lot of those linear processes, those rule-based processes have been automated or outsourced. So it's almost become that much more important to look at this nonlinear kind of complexity space to really stay competitive. This, to me, is where the advantage is. So what are some of the ways that you help companies to look at their business. You talk about the organizational ecosystem. What are some of the aspects of that that can be helpful for businesses?
Thank you for asking about that. We have, and again, I think one of the challenges we have in this, in this field is to translate the terms that we use very freely. So the conversation that you and I have, Olivia, we can get very much into sort of the complexity science geek talk very quickly.
Yeah.
So at any point, please feel free to ask me to translate. But what I really hope that this conversation will help folks is to understand that there's a different way to look at what already exists, and it's a different lens. And there's some words that we use quite frequently. We use, adaptability, the concept of organizing and self-organizing. We also consider patterns. And so patterns is where I want to begin the conversation. So all organizations have an ecosystem. And from a scientific perspective, we know what ecosystems are. It's sort of the environment in which we thrive or die or grow. And healthy ecosystems continually have influences and information, new things being brought into the ecosystem. So if you had an ecosystem that had nothing from the outside to ever come in and nothing from the inside to ever go out, ultimately it would shrivel up and die. Mm-hmm. And so what you want to do is you want to be able to have the air and water and things happening. Good things and bad things, but that's what keeps an ecosystem alive and vibrant. So from an organizational ecosystem, what we really wanted to do was to look at how could we talk about this in a way that seemed true and useful. How could we create both the awareness and also the conversation that would allow any organization to really understand what's happening in their organization as they start to make change or have new initiatives. So one example is we have 3 different areas, which is a new way to think about how do you look at your organization. And again, this will go back to some terms I've already used. We have history, context, and culture. And the history is the organizational systems, traditions, their milestones. Every organization, no matter how old or young it is, has a history, and that history is part of who they are. There's a pattern. So if we know that every 4th of July the organization gets together for a company picnic, it's part of the pattern of how they've always done things and how they intend to do things in the future. So there's an experience and there's expectations. Context is the surroundings in which the organizational system operates. And this is where we can't live in an isolated environment even if we choose to. So in Japan, when there was the tsunami, which was such a horrible thing, everybody felt that they were able to control what was going to happen within the nuclear power environment. I mean, all the systems were in place. There was a history, there was experience, there was expectations, but all of a sudden something really dramatically significant happened that they had not prepared for. I mean, people didn't think that there was ever going to be an environmental experience that was going to literally throw out the nuclear power plant and then all the subsequent impact on people, environments, business, etc. Mm-hmm. But we can't operate, in an isolated environment. And the surroundings will, in an ecosystem, impact what happens. Right. Then we have the culture. And this is in my mind, this is that beautiful, messy place, which is where leadership and influence comes in, and we may talk about that later. But the culture is who and what the organization is at its core. So as we start to have these conversations, we then begin to introduce and help organizations recognize that these deeply embedded patterns in an organization and understanding these dimensions allows for a greater awareness, and we call it precision in creating the opportunities for change. And within the ecosystem, the patterns that exist, and we can think of these as behaviors, they're always present, and they operate at multiple layers simultaneously. So they operate in all divisions. They operate even when you leave work. They're not immediately visible. This is another complexity sort of construct. They're not visible, but they exist. And because they exist, they're impacting what happens, some of the outcomes. And they aren't necessarily predictably influenced because they're so deep, they're so core to who the organization is. The inputs and outputs are not proportional. So despite the fact that I may try to change something all the time, I may not be able to guarantee that the end output is going to be proportional to how much effort I put into the input.
Tell me a little bit about how we might influence those 3 dimensions and make them work for us to be more successful in our business.
That's really the core question that everybody asks. Okay, we have these things. Now what do we do with them? And I think that the first one, and you had mentioned this when you were introducing the show, was creating an opportunity for inquiry. And understanding what the organization's structural framework is really critical to being able to start to shift them. And as I'd said before the break, these are really deep structures, and I think of it as building the house. You don't tear the house down easily, but you can begin to, over time, and specifically understanding that it is a complex adaptive environment, you can begin over time to start to shift these very core ecosystem patterns. And the next level of how you do it is really what I call the operational day-to-day work that is currently being done in an organization. And by shifting what you want your outcomes to be, you can start to shift the deeper patterns. So we call these levers. Again, it's a matter of trying to translate complexity terminology to the human systems and the behavior that we all know within the organizations without saying, oh, here's the newest flavor of the month and our work is better than others. Because what it is just a different lens, a new way to look at how you can start to influence what's happening in the organization. And this is where we can take a goal and an objective, and we can say, how can you move from where you are now to where you want to go? And so before I talk about the specific levers, what I'd like to introduce is this concept of having, in the organizational ecosystem, having a landscape. So if we think of, the X and Y axis graph, and that's a visual that everyone's familiar with. Right. And we think of the lower left-hand corner as the current state, where you are now. And in complexity speak, that lower left-hand corner is where you are close to predictability and close to consequence. So those are the behaviors where you want people, the status quo behaviors, where you want to be able to predict and know what your outcomes are going to be. So if I'm working an airport and I'm in, traffic control, I'd like to know that my procedures, that how I operate, the people who are up there are really in that lower left-hand corner. The upper right-hand corner, if you think again of this graph, could be more of a mutation space, could be the place where you would like to be able to have there be very few rules and regulations. And the patterns that are emerging there are constantly changing. It's innovation, it's disruption, and those are all terms that people are pretty familiar with. And that unknown space is where weird things happen and it's very messy. There's a middle space, and that middle space is where most organizations want to be. And again, going back to what we had discussed earlier, it's this sort of self-organizing space. This is where emerging information is happening, where we're experimenting, we're trying new things, where we may be really shifting patterns, but it hasn't shifted so significantly that it's gone down into that lower left-hand corner, where those deep, deep, deep patterns are. So we look at this as a status quo area in the lower left-hand corner, this mutation, exciting space. And then really in that upper right-hand corner, a place where there's almost no rules. There's lots of innovation. There's lots of risk-taking. There's lots of failure, but at the same time, there's possible successes. If you think of this landscape diagram as your organization and you want to be able to start to shift these patterns and behaviors and tactical actions. So again, it's not just, we want people to act differently. We want our organization to think differently. You really want the bottom line results, because if you can't have the deliverables, then what is the real purpose of the organization, even if it's not specifically manufacturing a product? So we like to uncover what we call sort of higher level patterns and allow there to be attention on these levers. So these levers, these actions that people can take, very specific actions, can be assessed, they can be prioritized, and then they can be shifted to move towards more results. Okay, so, and these are 4 areas that I actually think people are already doing in the organization, but by increasing this understanding and awareness, we can bring the level of current behavior to a point where it's more integrated into the overall context, culture, and history of the organization. So the 4 areas are connections, and this is creating and expanding new intersections of people, ideas, and resources. Think of network. Think of internal, social networks and organizations. A new connection is we're reaching out to our customers in different ways. We're allowing people to contribute to ideas on a regular basis and to experiment with those ideas. We're bringing different people into different conversations. So to some extent, we're flattening how we do our projects and business, and we're looking for the opportunity to have a diversity, and that's the second one, of creating and embracing differences. And differences in a complex environment mean it's not the same thing. It is not a pejorative or negative. You want difference. And as I had mentioned before about an ecosystem, a biological ecosystem, if it's completely closed off and there is no diversity or new information or new things coming into the ecosystem, it will ultimately entropy and die. So you want that diversity of ideas, questions, disruption, messy things that don't necessarily completely conform or fit into a pattern, but at the same time, they're bringing up new opportunities. And then that brings us to experiments. And experiments allows us to incent curiosity, intelligent risk-taking, and learning. And from my perspective, that's really at the core of working within complex human systems. The experiments give us ways in which the individuals within the system feel that they can be rewarded and offered opportunities for bringing what they know to an organization. And as a really interesting sort of comment about that was there was a paper that was recently released by Gartner on what the Apple iPad and other mobile devices mean for collaboration planners. And there were several things within that paper that go exactly into the concept of experiments. They talked about the fact that workers were initially bringing their mobile devices to work and working sort of secretively because it was more efficient. The official enterprise didn't support what they were doing, and they were taking their work and finding a time, place, software that they could do things better outside of the organization.
That's fascinating.
Isn't that fascinating? It's a great. I'm happy to send you the link for it to share with the audience.
Please, yes.
And then what they did was they started to, a certain group said, well, could we all use our iPads at work? And they were then able to bring it to customers, and they started to, begin to develop proprietary applications that were based on work needs that were, again, outside of the enterprise.
Wow.
And so all of a sudden you have a lot of this experimentation happening, really intelligent risk-taking because they want to do their jobs better. No one wants to fail. Right. And an incredible amount of learning. So if you think of this, and I won't go any more into the article, but you've got the idea of what it says. The key is for the organization to start to really embrace and recognize this. And it's not easy. So anybody who's out there, it's really hard. But you can begin to see how it could shift a pattern of behavior. And if you say, hey, we really want to create different kinds of connections, we really want intelligent risk-taking, and how are people learning? What are they doing?
And I was thinking that there's probably challenges within some companies that perhaps don't have good connection. And so I'm thinking some older, more siloed companies would have a harder time with this. Has that been true in your experience?
Of course. And I think it's, there's another term that I often use. There's no naughty and there's no nice. So that there's not a good or a bad way to do something. And clearly, if it's working, bravo. But at the same time, it isn't always working, and it's not working for all the reasons that I think there's probably not a single person in an organization, even if they aren't in a business organization, that don't feel the impact of, escalating information, shifts in how people want to do things, how they are being demanded to deliver different items, information, products, services. The old adage of a 24/7 world is now being even exacerbated beyond that, because it's a 24/7 world where we're supposed to know everything that happened in the past, and we're supposed to be able to predict everything that's going to happen in the future. And so, a silo is an opportunity to have very constricted, very regulated types of information and exchanges. But inevitably, and I'm not in a position to predict when, and most CEOs of companies cannot predict when, there is going to be enough impact, enough diversity influences, things happening to the organization that silo is going to get broken down. So I like to think of this as, an imagery that we often use is of a sand pile. And so each time you put a grain of sand on the sand pile, it will start to build and build and build and build. And then at some point, one grain will sort of dissipate the whole structure. That's been referred to as tipping points. It's, goes back to the concept of, in the organization, you don't necessarily have proportional inputs and outputs. So I may be dropping those pieces of sand trying to change something and nothing's happening, and all of a sudden the whole structure changes. And so we can't ignore just the dynamics of what's happening around us. Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and Instagram, and all the ways that we communicate are new ways of having those connections. And with each connection, there's a possibility of a new idea. There's a possibility of several drops of sand or grains of sand being put onto a structure until those connections, those ideas start to tip what we do. Normal examples that we all know are what happen when, there's an isolated event or seemingly isolated event in another part of the world, but then all of a sudden hundreds and hundreds of thousands or millions of Twitter feeds pick it up. Or one picture that is shared can change how people are reacting and responding. Whole regimes have come down because of that. So why would organizations think that they couldn't or wouldn't be affected by it? So yes, connections, I think, are the one that's most easily identifiable with our media networked, connected world that we live in. But at the same time, I think that, the diversity of the ideas, being able to embrace when someone has an idea or a connection that may not seem to have been part of the original structure, it's an organization can really leverage this. It's a wonderful way in which to bring at a very low cost new thoughts and perspectives into that organization. And then what we're doing, to just go back to before we move forward, is this concept of being able to shift these patterns. And the beauty of the levers, of these very small sort of grains of sand actions, if you may, is that these things are always present. And again, they're always operating at multiple levels, but you can pull them. You can take a lever and you can shift it a little bit, and you can modify it directly. So it's not so deeply embedded that you can't take the Titanic and shift it around. Mm-hmm. It can be very easily measured. If you said to a group, what I'd really like you to do is to think of how you can connect to everybody else in the organization and outside the organization, and in 2 weeks, put out some questions and see what kind of responses you get.
Yeah, and I was thinking also, we mentioned diversity again, that companies that are newer maybe have many more cultures or ages or different specialized skills within their company, so there'd be a lot more diversity in that way. And I've also heard about companies just having people change roles. So, for example, I worked for a credit card bank where they actually took the chief marketing officer and they made him the chief risk officer, and they made the chief risk officer the chief marketing officer. So they both had a real perspective for the other person's responsibilities and brought in that, I think, like a diverse point of view to really stimulate, and it worked really well.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a wonderful way of what I would consider doing an experiment of learning. Of intelligent risk-taking. I mean, the chief marketing officer and the chief, risk officer, at that point, they have such a deep knowledge base that shifting them is really an intelligent risk-taking. But it does push them outside of their patterns of behavior. And, I think that there were probably moments that was pretty scary, but at the same time, think of the tremendous learning and the ability to have these new ways of looking at what the opportunities were. Mm-hmm. And I would applaud any organization who would do that, and who can do it in a way where they understand that you're going to incent individuals for taking these risks, and that there's no naughty, there's no nice, mm-hmm. that there really is looking at what's best for the organization on an overall basis, which is interesting because there was another article as I was doing research, which was such a great opportunity to look at what was happening out there. And this week in the leadership section of Forbes, there was a great article about why Apple investors should worry. So I love Apple. Just download the new operating system on my iPhone. But what they were talking about, and I think this goes back to what we were discussing last week, was the fact that at some point in time, if the organization gets too comfortable and recognizes that they need to sustain who they are, ecosystem patterns, what they deliver, and what they've done in the past, without truly recognizing that they cannot keep themselves immune from what's happening around them. You go back to the concept of Apple is a perfect example, and a lot of people are just up in arms with, we came to expect something that you're not even meeting the pattern that you used to have. And what are the things that, as a leader, what's happening within the organization at the highest levels that's squelching some of that sort of innovative, creating things that people don't know what they want yet in the organization?
Yeah, I would think you could even look at these levers, and I know we haven't touched on all of them yet, but as a way to value a company, that if they're doing these well, even though you may not know what they're going to have going on in a year or two, if I were looking to invest, those are the things I'd probably care about.
I think that's terrific. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but you're absolutely right, Olivia. And maybe even within organizations, as you're looking to expand or start new initiatives, do you have within that group the opportunities to have ways to look at this as a complex adaptive process? I mean, I think Agile software does that really beautifully. Mm-hmm. They look at, we have an expectation, but at the same time, we recognize that we don't absolutely know what the end product is going to be as we start the product.
Right. And to me, that's fun, but I've had to work at letting go of always being attached to outcomes, especially in business and, and to some extent in my life. But I think if you've got these core principles and these ways to evaluate, you do well. And we're almost up on a break, but I just wanted to touch on the idea of this experiment area, or when you were talking about the XY graph. So at the very bottom or the bottom left corner is where you absolutely need certainty. And I often think about this. I'm a statistician, so I know that if I'm looking at whether a marketing program is more powerful than another one, I might be fine with 90% certainty or 95% certainty is sort of typical in business. But if I'm testing something in medicine, I may want 99%, or, like your airline example is a great one, that we really don't want a very high risk of error. So I love this idea of an area within the organization that can take ideas and bring them in and maybe even just test and experiment and get comfortable with the level of risk before rolling it out. And we saved my favorite for last. So Denise, can you talk about the fourth lever for managing your ecosystem?
Thank you, Olivia. We call it Influenceship. And I want to qualify the fact that I'm not just creating a new word or new term to replace what everybody knows, but we think that it is really significantly different than leadership. And I began the conversation with what the complexity space offers is a way to understand and to influence what happens and changes within the organization, to understand patterns and then influence the changes or the shifting of the patterns. And influenceship allows us to re-envision the role of leadership as practiced by everyone. And I think that's the key. It's as practiced by everyone. They're just, unbelievably wonderful conversations and articles and books that, if we have good leaders, if there's a way that a leader can sort of start to, take the complexity, that word is often used when they talk about leaders of an organization, and help them reach an end goal, then, the organization is going to be successful. More management training is being used on leadership and employee development with the goal of them being leaders than on more traditional types of skill-based training. And which is very interesting. Mm-hmm. And part of it is that we want to make sure that we can have experience and expectations aligned. Mm-hmm. And leaders are, often put in a position where they're the people who are going to tell us how to do this. And I these are very broad comments. So I always feel like, oh my, 1,000 or 10,000 people out there are going to vote. We don't do it that way. And lots of great leaders exist out there. But if you look at a complex adaptive system, one of the things that is really core within the human systems is that each individual person has the freedom and will act independently. And so the question you have is, even if a leader, and remember, there's some wonderful ways, they cannot control everything that happens in their sphere of influence. Mm-hmm. And they cannot always lead 100% of the people in the organization, and things will inevitably happen outside of their control. And so whether they direct change and shift actions, how can you best do that? How can you best reach whatever that next stage of development is? And we think it's something called influenceship.
Well, before you go into that, I just want to say, too, that I am trained as an analyst, and I saw years ago that people did not really understand some of the stuff I was producing. So I might create models that help people influence how they market or how they approve risk or in manufacturing or pharmaceuticals or the energy sector. So what I got was that I had to start almost leading them and understanding their business so that I could almost guide them as to where these things could work, where they should not be used, and it was great when I saw a quote by Thornton May of the IT Academy. He said, it's not that we need to teach our leaders to understand analytics. We need to teach our analysts how to understand and become leaders, or something to that effect.
Love
so
that.
It really speaks to you, yeah. So.
Oh, absolutely. And give the analyst, interestingly enough, the opportunity to share and influence what's happening within the organization.
Oh, yeah. That makes sense.
So that, when you think of influence, and, here's some, I was looking up some of the, varying definitions that exist out there. And it's the capacity to have an effect on the character, development, or behavior of someone or something.
Interesting. That's great.
Great. It's to have an effect, to be able to provide information, to create a new connection, to engage in intelligent risk-taking, and to have meaningful differences be brought to light. That's all influence. The act or power of producing an effect without apparent exertion. So by the nature of the work that I'm doing, how I engage with people, how I bring my unknown or sort of secretive iPad to work with me so that I can do my job better. I'm influencing what the end outcomes are going to be, what the results are going to be. And if you look at it as an opportunity for everyone to have an opportunity to influence what they're doing in a transparent and meaningful way, then you're going to have an opportunity to have the organization benefit. And there are always going to be things that are going to happen that are not going to fit within or align within the organization. But when something dramatic happens, it's not going to be because you're uncovering these sort of secretive patterns that have sort of started to emerge, within sort of closed, contained areas. So it goes back to the landscape that we were talking about. If we want that middle area, that self-organizing area, the possibility space, if you may, things that are emerging and they are knowable. We may not know them completely, but they are knowable. That's where you can influence things. In the lower left-hand corner again, that's not necessarily, you can influence things, but guess what? Almost all the questions have been answered, and almost all of the answers are known, and we've built systems and processes around them.
Right.
And then in the upper corner, we can influence what we're doing there, but it's so filled with rapid changes that even the things that we do and the impacts we have will be escalated to a point where it may not filter into the overall organization. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say we have about 3 minutes left, and so finish your thought, and then maybe share a company that you know that's doing this really well, if you will.
Oh, there are lots of companies doing this very well. I think that we need to look at technology companies, certainly newer biotech companies, any of our social media companies are doing it because they're right in that self-organizing, information changing driven area.
And they're being given iPads at work, probably.
And they're being given iPads at work, and they're being allowed to some extent to draw from what's happening around them, between them, at all levels of the organization, internally and externally. But I think that there are lots of very large traditional companies that are still serving their processes and are looking at how can they better serve their customers and their employees. And they're General Electric, I think Procter & Gamble. I mean, you think of those as very entrenched, embedded, deeply set organizations, but they are changing, and they wouldn't be servicing and developing the products and ancillary support services around them that everybody is using if they weren't allowing there to be some sort of creative input and a more complex view of what's happening. But can I tell you what they are going to do in 5 years from now?
Yeah.
We don't know.
Yeah, that's a big unknown, I guess, for a lot of companies.
Absolutely. And we hope that what happens, what we need is this, continual opportunity to evaluate and reassess who we are as an organization and what we need to do, and make sure that the personal stakes of, well, if we don't do it this way, my career, my job is not going to be here anymore. If we as an organization can recognize that what we need to do is we need to be able to tap into the talent of the individuals and find out ways to let that be expressed in whatever the structure of the new emerging organization is.
Oh, so that goes back to the importance of the people and how well they can communicate, but also perhaps who they are and if they have, say, creative talents or abilities to really, to use the old phrase, think outside of the box. That sounds like it'd be very important.
Absolutely. It's that messy, beautiful culture. And it's what the human capital brings. It's really, as I said before, I think it's the most challenging and the most opportunistic opportunity any organization has. We are not machines, but we are gardens.
Right. And it's where I think once we get comfortable, it's where we have the most fun. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, so thank you. It looks like we're just about out of time. And so, Denise, I want to thank you so much for being my guest today. I do hope you'll come back and see us again.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Olivia. This has just been a delight. And I hope that we've been able to influence some people to think about what opportunities they have differently.
Yeah, I think we have. So thanks. So next week, we're going to explore a topic near and dear to my heart, and what we've mentioned a few times today already is human capital analytics. And so there's a book, Human Capital Analytics, How to Harness the Potential of Your Organization's Greatest Asset. And my guest will be Gene Pease, one of the authors of that book. So be sure to check my host page on voiceamerica.com for full details. I'm your host, Olivia Parr-Rud. Thank you for tuning in to Quantum Business Insights. See you next week.
Thank you for tuning in to Quantum Business Insights.